in the Christian community, there's some misconceptions of how to process grief and how to lament because you hear messages like rejoice in all things or God works all things together for good. And then we associate, oh, if I'm a person of faith and if I have a strong faith, then I'm not supposed to feel this way. Whereas really it's both and. I can have strong faith and I feel deeply and I'm grieving.
Hi, friend. You're listening to Find Hope Here. I'm your host, Teresa Whiting, author, speaker, ministry leader, friend, and fellow struggler. This is a podcast about the messy, complicated, painful parts of life, but also the beautiful, joy-filled hope that Jesus promises. Each week, we dig deep into God's Word together and talk about how His truth impacts our everyday lives. I'm not going to ask you to sit with me and have coffee because I seem to have my best conversations while I'm just doing life. So I'd love to hang out with you as you walk or fold laundry or drive to work. You're invited to join me in pursuing the hope God promises. No matter where you are or where you've been, I pray you always find hope here. Let's jump into today's episode. Well, welcome, friends. I am so excited to be back on the podcast with my friend Brenda Stewart. You may have recognized her name because Brenda's been on the podcast before, and she will be on the podcast again. Brenda is a recovery and a resilience coach. She is a therapist. She helps women overcome life's challenges, and she specializes in grief coaching, compassion fatigue, and burnout. In her therapy work, she guides women, especially those who have had eating disorders. She helps people overcome trauma. And Brenda has been a dear friend of mine for, many years, like over 30 years we have been friends. And it's just a dream that she and I have reconnected, and our hearts align so much in ministry and caring for people and sharing God's truth. And so, Brenda, I love what you bring to the podcast. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm just super excited and love doing this alongside you.
So, Brenda, for those who don't already know you, could you just tell them a little bit more about who you are and what you do, and maybe a fun fact?
Sure. So a little bit about me more personally than professionally, since you gave a great introduction, is I am obsessed with Boston Terriers. So
Mm-hmm.
anyone who knows me will know that I have grown up with Boston Terriers and have had two of my own. My current one currently has no eyes and has just been a really big inspiration to a lot of my clients and what I do in helping people overcome various challenges. And a fun fact is that I did competitive Polynesian dance for a little
I
while,
love that.
which typically shocks people. And yes, I did wear a wig because I didn't have long hair at the time.
That is a very fun fact. And tell us a little bit more about Samson.
He's been really active. He was very athletic as a dog. I did some agility training with him. He was part of a search team that was learning to go into schools to search out gunmetal. He did some dock diving, just really, really smart to the point of kind of could wear me out when he was younger. But just a great dog. Walked alongside with my dad with brain cancer and was his little companion.
Mm.
And then literally overnight went blind. So went to bed one day, was jumping after frisbees that afternoon, went to bed, and the next morning woke up completely blind. And so it's very sudden.
Wow. Wow. And you're writing a book about him.
I am on how to overcome adversity. So that
I
is in
love
the
it.
works.
I love it. But today we're here to talk about grief and lament. And I would love if you would share, why are those topics close to your heart? Like, what, I know you've walked through a lot of that in your own life, but can you tell the listeners a little bit about that?
Sure. Um, yeah, I think I'm somebody who's been acquainted with grief of various types. And it was through my own grief journey of, losing my dad. And I think he was fairly young age in his early 60s from brain cancer family friends, friends and grandparents who I was close with. And then some of the grief that comes along with being single, um, not what my heart's desire was, or not having children of my own. And so various types of grief and loss, the grief that comes after trauma,
Hmm.
when I experienced some trauma. And so as I've navigated that and really leaned into how do you navigate grief? It's such a messy and overwhelming journey, and really learned about lament and what that looks like. I just really became passionate about helping others in my therapy work as well as my coaching business. There's a lot of grief that's just involved in whatever clients are coming to the table with. And so really became passionate about wanting to help people.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned all those different avenues that grief enters our life because I think sometimes people think grief and they think the loss of a loved one. You know, somebody
Mhm.
dies, and so you kind of have permission to grieve. But grief comes in so many different arenas, like you said, navigating singleness, experiencing trauma. I think sometimes we grieve a life that we wanted, that we don't have, or even as an empty nest mom grieving the life that I had that's now over. I mean, there's just all kinds of different, and there's different degrees, right? There's really traumatic grief, and then there's things that are, this is the natural course of life, and everybody handles it differently. But I love that you named that there's different ways that grief can come into our life. And in your work as a therapist and a coach, as you mentioned, you've dealt with a lot of people with different kinds of grief, different kinds of losses. Would you say you see as a really common response to grief and loss?
That's a great question. It depends on the type, the type of loss somebody is dealing with. But there can be, tears, sadness, is huge. A lot of physical symptoms that people might not realize, but a lot of GI issues, immune system dysfunction, headaches, nausea, a lot of fatigue, low energy. And then on the other hand, there's people who cry a lot, and then there's people who just go to the avoidance or numb
Mm,
feelings. Like I just stay busy, I keep doing, 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 and then I don't really feel, right?
yeah.
Grief really impacts us in each area of life. So relationally, people can either withdraw and isolate, or they might feel like they need to be with someone all the time. There's just such a vast array of symptoms of grief.
Yeah. I like that you mentioned that because we are holistic, right? So we our bodies respond. And I think a lot of times we don't even realize, like, we don't put it together, like, oh, this is a symptom of grief. We just think, oh, what's wrong? Why am I sick? Why am I having these symptoms? Without even recognizing, like, oh, this is a grief response. This is my body dealing with that pain, that hurt, that loss, whatever it may be. So that's really insightful and helpful for people who maybe are not putting that together.
Yeah, there's absolutely a connection there for sure.
And you mentioned, you have done your own work around grief and lament. And we hear those words and people might think those are synonymous, but what would you say is the difference between grief and lament?
So one of the quotes and I will probably get to this, but in the book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, the author says, sorrow tunes our heart to the songs of lament. And I just love that quote. It's so
Mm,
powerful. And I think it represents the difference of grief is the internal emotional response that happens in our bodies when we lose something. And this can also be a positive loss. Right? So many times we think of just grief and loss through death or through something that we're mourning and really miss. But even a change of a job or moving across the country, even if it's something you're excited about, still involves loss, right? It's change. And so there's grief. So grief is that emotional internal experience where I look at lament is sort of the way we journey through grief. So
mm,
lament is the expression of those deep emotions.
yes. That's helpful. That's helpful. I think I also read that book, and it has been so amazing to me the way that the author, and I'm going to hold the book up for anybody on YouTube. The book is Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, and I think his name is Mark Rogop. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but one of the things that I took away from this book is, and I don't know exactly where he says this, but I think he says everyone can grieve, but Christians specifically lament, because lament is when you take that grief and you turn it toward God.
Mhm.
And it's that process, like you said, it's a process of journeying through your grief. So he describes this four-step process where we turn toward God, we bring our complaint, we ask boldly, and we choose to trust. And throughout the book, he gives a bunch of examples through different psalms of lament, and even through the book of Lamentations,
Mhm.
where there you see this process of step one is turning to God, and it's not always a gentle, sweet, get on your knees, bow your head. Sometimes it's like rage or crying out or pounding your fist or saying, why and how, and asking questions of God. And I love that he kind of normalizes that. Like, that's okay to approach God that way. And then he talks about bringing your complaint, and he talks about the honesty, like that we can come to God so honestly, so truthfully, in exactly where we're at, whether that's sad or angry or whatever it may be. And then he says to ask boldly. And that is where the psalm kind of comes to God and says, do something about this. Like, here's the issue. And I need you to intervene. I need you to do this. And a lot of times they're very specific requests, like, God, if you would please do this thing. And then choosing to trust. Like, he talks about and, but, and yet, that in the Psalms of Lament, so often there's that hinge word of, I'm hurt, I'm angry, I want you to do something about this, but I trust you. Yet you are still good. All of that. And so, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the book, because I think it's been so, so helpful for me to go through that book and to read it and to understand a little bit more about the process of lament.
Yeah. I love that you brought up those four steps because I really think it's a guide to really process the pain, right? And as Christians, I really believe we're called to lament because we're going to experience suffering in life. We're going to experience pain and grief. And so, how do we navigate it? And I think scripture gives us the way
Mm-hmm.
to process through grief and really, rather than turn away from God or be angry at God or have it cause a big spiritual kind of crisis, which sometimes will happen, but how do we navigate through that too, right? The key word is through. And so rather it can be something that really draws us closer to God and reminds us of, yeah, even if, right, I'm not healed from this chronic illness, even if my prayers aren't answered in the way that I desire, right? I still trust you. I
Mm-hmm.
still know that you are good. I still know that you are sovereign. And really leaning into the truths despite what our emotions are saying.
Yes. Why don't we do that, Brenda? Like, what is it? Because you said this is like, it's a gift for Christians to bring this to God, but we don't. I think so often we have no idea how to grieve. Honestly, I didn't hear the word lament until just a few years ago. I read a different book called No More Faking Fine by Esther Fleece, which was another phenomenal book about lament. And that was the first time I ever heard it. I've been in church for 40 years, and I've never heard lament explained or even encouraged. It's
Mhm.
just, we have this like really warped way of grieving. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is our problem and why do we not know how to do this?
Yeah, my take on it is I don't think it's something that we do in our society or in our culture well. If you look at it in other cultures, like sometimes they shut everything down for 7 days and just mourn, right?
Mm,
Or there's time. to process. There's rituals that are done. There's ways of navigating the grief. Whereas here we're like, oh, you get 3 days of bereavement if your spouse or your parent or your child passes away, and then come back to work. Right?
Wow.
It's a very, I don't think it's modeled well in society, for one. And so then it becomes this like, this isn't normal. This is uncomfortable. Is something wrong with me because I'm feeling like this, but I don't see other people handling it like this. Right.
Yes.
And then two, I think in the Christian community, there's some misconceptions of how to process grief and how to lament, because you hear messages like rejoice in all things or God works all things together for good. And then we associate, oh, if I'm a person of faith and if I have a strong faith, then I'm not supposed to feel this way.
Mm.
Right. And it becomes this like, if my faith is strong, then this isn't going to happen. Whereas really it's both and. I can have strong faith and I feel deeply and I'm grieving. Right.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, or there's, people will try to be helpful when you're in seasons of grief and loss and say things that really aren't helpful. And knowing, like, well, I'm sure they're in a better place, or God needed another angel, or whatever. It kind of puts a damper on our felt ability to really feel what we feel, to process the emotion, and have support in it, because support is super key.
Mm.
We're not meant to walk through it alone. But when we hear those comments, it just feels like, oh, I'll kind of shrink back.
Right, right. Go into that a little bit more as far as if somebody is encountering somebody who is in a grieving process, what would be better things to say or do?
Sometimes not saying anything at all is the best thing you can say.
Mm-hmm.
Or just say, simple things like, I'm praying. I just want you to know I really care. I want you to know that God brought you to mind today. And I just wanted to check in with you and let you know I remember. Right?
Mm.
Don't be afraid to say the person's name that they lost, right? Because that's a fear that people have, that they're going to forget the person or other people are going to forget. So ask, say the name.
Mm.
Um, you can also just really engage in practical things. When someone's going through grief, especially the early stages, there's so much brain fog that happens. I think it's a little bit of a way God gives us some anesthesia as we're walking through it. And you don't really realize that you're in that brain fog until it lifts, right? And then it's like, oh wow, I how did I function? Um,
Right, right.
and doing practical things like, hey, I'm gonna have groceries delivered, or like meal trains, right? Some of the
Mm-hmm.
practical needs. Hey, can I pick your kids up from school today? Or whatever that might be, rather than asking, if you need anything, let me know. Because half the time the person is not going to know. And
Mm-hmm.
there's so many decisions flying at them, and it's hard to make decisions in grief, that it's a nice sentiment, but then it can be hard to really engage in further after that.
Right, right. One of the things that you said earlier that I want to kind of circle back to is you said something about, you look at other people and how they're handling things and you think, well, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I still grieving? This other person has gone through the same thing and they're not grieving the same way. And I think we get into a lot of trouble when we compare ourselves because we think our grief process should look like somebody else's. Secondly, we don't know what's going on in their heart. They might be feeling the same way, but everybody's afraid to show it. Everybody's afraid to be the first one to cry. And I noticed all the time, even in any setting, when somebody cries, the first thing they do is apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm trying to learn not to do that because that tells people tears are not acceptable. And
Mhm.
and I don't want to send that message because if I have to be sorry for crying, then you better be sorry when you start crying. And we don't know how, we know how to rejoice with those who rejoice, but we don't really know how to weep with those who weep. And like you said, in our culture and in other cultures, that is it's something that they do really well. I know one of the things I learned is lament is not just an individual thing. Like there are psalms of lament that are individual, and there are psalms of lament that are communal. And so it wasn't a one person just lamenting, it was a whole community. It was all of the Israelites mourning, weeping together. And so I don't see that happening in our culture, in our churches. I just don't see this communal lament.
Mhm.
Is that something you've ever experienced anywhere?
Not really, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's, I think a lot of what we do it alone.
Hmm.
I think we follow that individual lament more than group lament or in community, which is sad.
It is. It is because there's so much strength in weeping with those who weep and coming alongside somebody and grieving together. I mean, the closest thing I could think of was 9/11 when our whole country was just devastated at once and everybody kind of did come together, but that was kind of a very rare occurrence. It's not common that we come together and grieve and mourn and weep together.
Yeah, I think there's one element that stands out to me in that because then I look at 9/11 or I look at things like the recent hurricanes this year and the devastation that occurred in the Southeast. And I think there's an element of people grieve, but how we do that looks like let's go into action mode, right?
Mm,
We're going to come together and help each other out and cut these trees down and clear this person's house out and see what we can salvage. And so we we're better if we know what to do because it can make us uncomfortable to just be, right? To be with somebody who's weeping, to just have our presence alone be what's so important. And I have experienced this some in like if there's somebody in a hospital or and the hours are long in waiting that we know the loved one is going to pass away or whatever, and there's people that come and you're there. And so in elements, there's the presence and that community. But then I think once the celebration of life service is over, or once the new job starts, or once the initial chronic illness diagnosis is gone, or the miscarriage, or whatever, it's like within a couple of weeks, everybody goes back to their life. And that's not to say that's bad. Everybody has a life still to live. But then that process of lament after the initial event in community seems lost.
mm. And I think even there's an expectation that people have, like, are you okay yet? It's almost unspoken, but there is that expectation of like, oh, you're still grieving, like that. Shouldn't you be over that by now? And that is so hurtful and harmful to the person who's grieving. What
Well,
happens to us? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
no, I was going to say it's one of the hardest questions to answer when you're somebody who is in the season of grief and lament is how are you? How are you doing? Because it's like, how do you answer that? Right?
Mm,
To be honest, you want to be like, good, I'm okay, I'm whatever. And so I started just naming when I was in these initial seasons of my own grief and loss journey of, I'm taking it a moment at a time and God's faithful, or today's been a really hard day, right? And having doesn't mean you have to like break down in front of everybody every time, to be honest, but it's what's something a little more congruent than I'm good, thanks,
hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. I think it's really good to give people words, to be able to be honest. So that is helpful. I want to ask you what happens to us? What happens physically, emotionally, relationally when we fail to grieve? Like you said, like we just jump into action mode or we fix it or we stuff it down. Like what happens to us relationally or even physically or emotionally?
Yeah, I think it can lead to more irritability and conflict in relationships, or it can lead to a lack of depth in relationships because you're protecting your heart and guarding, right? So more feelings of isolation and withdrawal. So it just complicates what's already there after
Mm,
loss. Physically, it can lead to a lot of stress-induced illnesses. Various autoimmune conditions can flare. If you're genetically predisposed to something, it can activate that gene
mm,
and turn into other illnesses, can give you a lot of immune system dysregulation, um, chronic headaches, migraines, all of the things. As far as emotionally, I think it can lead to despair,
mm.
more like clinical depression or anxiety. And it really, I think it just keeps you from living, right? It makes what you already have gone through in suffering elongate,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
continue, and it keeps you from actually still being able to engage in the life God has given you.
So, with those things in mind, we don't want to stuff our grief. We don't want to bypass it. So, what are some things, like really practical ways that people can process their grief, express their grief?
Mhm. Yeah, I would love to give some helpful tips on ideas of how to express or process. Before I do that, I just want to let people know if they're listening and we've been talking about sort of emotional expression and feelings, someone might be listening who's like, I don't really cry. Is something wrong with me?
Hmm.
Right? I don't really feel much. And the answer is no, nothing's wrong with you. I actually am not a person who cries very easily myself. And after, the first year after significant losses or, some ongoing losses in my own life, I found myself more just someone who kind of turns inward and is reflective or more quiet, more pensive, right? Um, but I had to actually invite those emotions because otherwise that can turn into despair, right?
Mm.
And just sort of this deepened thought, and I'm withdrawing. And so some people cry a lot and emote a lot. Other people are wired different and don't necessarily do that. And that's okay too. It's about still having ways to express and
Hmm.
process.
Hmm.
So
That's helpful.
some of the things that I encourage clients that I work with to do is really engage in creative arts. Um, so in the process of lament, you can do this as if you go through these four steps. But as a Christian, worship, I think, is powerful. So finding songs that can, or even instrumental music that can give language and emotion and expression to what um, relates to what you're feeling internally can be
Hmm.
powerful. I think one thing I like to do is write a poem.
Hmm.
And I keep this on a note on my phone. And the only rule is that it can't rhyme. So we don't get too stuck in our head about, oh, what's a rhyming word for this? And just anytime I'm starting to feel that sadness or feel the longing or the loss, I'll add a couple more stanzas to the poem. And
Hmm.
it's actually neat because you can see it start to transform through the process. Otherwise, paint, do pottery, sculpt. You can even just embody the emotion, right? If I was feeling like really, I just felt heaped over, then let my body heap over and stay in that for a moment and just be with it and then shift
Hmm.
out, right? So a lot of creative arts, journaling. You can do non-dominant hand journaling, which helps you engage with the emotion more than our logical brain.
That's interesting. These are such great ideas. I love them. I love them. One thing, I mean, I haven't tried all of these things, but one thing I have done in more recent times is just allowing myself to feel the emotion in my body. And if that means like shaking or like or like just doing things with my mouth or my hands or my legs, it's just it's amazing what happens internally when you let that stuff out externally. It's just, it's like there is something that happens as you process. And I think of the Old Testament. They would tear their hair and pound their fists and, put ashes on their head. You would see
Yeah.
visible signs of grief.
Yes.
And we have been so conditioned to hide any sign of grief. I mean, if we're crying, we are like wiping our mascara ASAP, like we cannot let anybody know that we cried.
Mhm.
And in that day, they're like, look at me. I am lamenting. My clothes are ripped. My ashes are on my head because I am in mourning. And I think we could learn so much from the way God designed us and the way he allowed people to express that grief in
Mhm.
scripture. What are some, and we've talked about this a little bit, like some occasions of grief and lament that we don't typically think of?
Oh, there's so many. So if I don't include a situation that somebody listening here is has that I haven't said, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It's just there's such a big list.
Mm,
But I think if we look at, parents whose children aren't walking with the Lord, or we can look at, reproductive losses, whether that's not being able to have children, miscarriages, babies or children who die, um, even those who are adopted, birth moms who give their child up, there's grief and loss with that,
mm.
right?
And I
Um,
would say, even for the child, the grief and loss, even at that age that they can't verbalize that, but there is that tremendous loss and grief that they maybe have never been given words for.
yeah, their nervous system still knows, right?
Hmm.
It was laid in their
Hmm.
nervous system. So those are some losses. It might be you're in a difficult marriage and there's grief and loss with that, right? Um, or singleness, not having children. It might be chronic illness. I think that's a big lost one, and one that goes, people are there around the initial diagnosis of a chronic illness, but then the person with the chronic illness is living that day in and day out. And there's so many types of losses that come along with that. That is a big, there's a big piece of grief there.
Mm.
And, life not being what you thought it would, like you mentioned, loss of hopes and dreams or expectations. So there's losses that come along with aging. I'm trying to age gracefully, but I'm not a fan. I'm like aging for the birds. I send that to my sister like a couple times a month, probably. Um,
Hmm.
and then really the grief that comes from experiencing trauma, whether that's childhood trauma or trauma in adulthood, there's a lot of grief and loss on various aspects of somebody's personhood. And so it's really important to honor and acknowledge the grief that comes through as part of the process of your trauma healing as well.
Hmm. Yeah, that's something I can totally identify with. As a child, I endured childhood sexual abuse, and then when I became a Christian, I'm like, I'm a new creature in Christ. I'm healed. And in a sense, yes, God healed that wound, but it took many years for me to recognize, like, I never actually grieved the loss of innocence, the
Mhm.
pain, the sense of betrayal, like all of those things were things that it took me a long time to realize, like, I have to work through that. I have to grieve those things and cry over them and lament and cry out to God. And that was something I think that sometimes Christians, they just think like, oh, I'm saved now. And so all is good. And we kind of sweep that process under the rug to our own hurt. Because that stuff, like you said, it's in our bodies and we need to get it out. We need to grieve and express the pain and the loss of those things. So I
Absolutely.
appreciate you bringing that out. Was there anything else, anything that I missed or that we wanted to touch on?
I don't think so, other than it's just an individual process. Grief and the journey of grief looks differently for every person. There's no set time, there's no one size fits all for grief. And so giving yourself a lot of grace, a lot of compassion, and a lot of internal coaching, I like to say, of just take the next 5 minutes, right? An hour
Mhm.
sometimes is too long, a day is way too long. But okay, for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to get through this and I'm going to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And so really being kind to yourself in the process, as well as reach out to people for support. Sometimes people don't read our minds, or actually all the time people don't read our minds.
Hmm.
People are not mind readers. And so we might be waiting and hoping someone reaches out, but it's okay to just reach out to them and say, you know what,
Mm.
today's a really hard day. I would love to connect.
Yeah. Yeah, that is really, really helpful. Um, so as we've talked, there might be somebody listening who says, there are things in my life that I'm realizing I have never grieved. Or
Mhm.
maybe they're in the process of grieving something now and they're just feeling stuck or overwhelmed. Would you speak directly to that person who's listening?
Sure. First, I just want you to know that you're not alone and you don't have to walk the process alone. Grief is an isolating journey in and of itself, and there are people out there, there's support out there. It might take some time to find it, but it's there. And then allow yourself to just acknowledge the losses, just to allow them to exist, name them, write them in a journal, and begin to really wrestle with your sorrow versus shoving it down, numbing it, or avoiding it. You can try some of the ways that we talked about here, um, and know that healing happens in time. Grief doesn't end. We don't just hit a day where it's like, okay, close that chapter and I'm now ready to go. But life builds around it and new things come and new chapters are there, and you can feel joy again if you're in a season where it feels like that's never gonna be. It will, as
Mm,
long as you allow yourself to journey through grief and not get stuck in it. Don't set up camp there. We're going to visit and journey through.
that is so helpful. Thank you. Thank you. And for those who are listening and they want help, they want to go maybe a step further, you and I are doing a workshop together. And I would love to share that with the listeners and just talk a little bit about what that's going to be, the purpose of it, and maybe what some of the attendees can expect. So, do you want to talk a little bit about the workshop we're doing?
So, yes, I would love to. I'm super excited to be doing this workshop with you. So, March 28th and 29th, we are going to host two options. One is the 28th from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time will be an online workshop for people who live anywhere. It can be in another country, it can be anywhere in the US, but it's 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And you might be surprised, you can still feel really connected, even though it's virtual. You can be in the comfort of your own home. You don't have to be out somewhere else. You don't have to think about driving afterwards if you don't want to. So that's one option. And then Saturday morning from 9 to 11 a.m., we're going to be in St. Petersburg, Florida, over in your territory,
Mm-hmm.
and doing an in-person workshop. So people are welcome to fly in for it, to drive in for it. If you're local, we'd love to have you. Space is limited, so sign up sooner rather than later to get a spot. But it's just going to be such a powerful time. It's going to be a time where we actually look at God's word more in depth of, okay, what are the examples of lament and what does this look like and how do we do it? We're going to go more in depth as far as the grief process in the human body, soul, mind, and spirit, what that looks like, and how to navigate it when you experience any of these things. And then really do some practical exercises and application. And so you'll walk away feeling like you have tools as well as having a healing experience in those 2 hours. Anything else you would add?
I would add how excited I am that you are a part of this because I think you bring so much wisdom and experience and the knowledge of how to help a group navigate grief together. This is really an opportunity for people to not feel alone in their grief. And so that's one of the things I absolutely love about it. And I'm just really excited. I hope that both of these workshops fill up. And like Brenda said, we are keeping them intentionally small. We don't want a large group of people. We want it to be small. So
Yeah, we still have a few spots open now, so be sure to sign up in the links in the show notes.
yep, links in the show notes. It's called the Healing Power of Lament Workshop. So Brenda, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being a part of helping people heal, helping people navigate grief and walk through loss and come out the other side. I appreciate you so much.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for the work you're doing as well.
Thanks for hanging out with me today on Find Hope Here. To find anything I mentioned on the episode, go to teresawhiting.com/listen. That's where you can find all the show notes. And remember to hit that subscribe button. If you want to go the extra mile and leave a review, that would be amazing and it would mean so much to me. I'd like to leave you with this prayer from Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit, you may abound in hope.